Greetings and felicitations.
Hip, hip, hurrah, tally-ho.
Hey, my little biscuit.
Hey, Puddin'.
Okay, what did you think about this classic 1960 movie, The Time Machine?
It was an excellent movie. I really enjoyed it.
All right, let's talk about the details before we go into the breakdown. Now, it was directed and produced by George Pal. Screenplay by David Duncan, and it was based on the H.G. Wells book, The Time Machine. It starred Rod Taylor, Alan Young, released August 17th, 1960, with a running time of 103 minutes. The budget was just over $800,000, but the box office took in $2.61 million. Definitely a success.
Amazing. Yeah, I did hear that the budget was, lower than what they really wanted for a sci-fi movie.
Mm-hmm. And they would have liked to have filmed it in London, but because of budget restraints, they had to do it on a Hollywood studio lot. Hollywood studio lot, often known as the Meet Me in St. Louis lot. That staircase. Staircase was also seen in the Twilight Zone. So we know, especially of that era, they reused quite a few sets and lots, and you see things familiar.
Yeah, but it still had that look, though. It was supposed to be Victorian England.
And it was perfect. They did a wonderful job with it.
Yes, they did. Even though, now Rod Taylor is actually Australian, but he sounded American in this, didn't he?
He did, yes.
Yeah, but they had like his best friend sounded Scottish.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And with regard to the lots, we know that in quite a few of these scenes that were in the future, they were used on these lots. I mean, I think it was just fascinating all around. The period piece set as well as the futuristic set. I mean, it started out as an inventor in Victorian England. He builds a time machine, and you'd think he'd go back in time and forward in time, but he never goes further back than his present time. So it's essentially a futuristic movie.
And in some ways I could see that, because I would be more interested in the future too, just to know what's going to happen, because we already know what happened in the past. Some people might want to fill in the blanks a little, but yeah, I think the future's more interesting.
Wow, that's fascinating. The thing that I'd do first is go back in time. Wow, and the first thing you would do is go forward in time? If you had a time machine?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, we didn't discuss the details of it, so that's news to me. Why would you go future? You say because you want to see how things are going to happen?
Yeah, just to see what's going to happen, yes.
Well, obviously, the protagonist felt the same way. So, what do you think about the plot of the movie? His building a time machine and moving forward little by little.
Now it is interesting too, because when we were watching it, and I did say, wait, did they say that the machine could only go forward? And at the time they had, they never even say it until the end of the movie that he can actually go backwards with his time machine.
Yes.
But it was good though, because he sees this progression of what's going to happen to mankind.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he finds out there is a world war, and then he finds out that there's about to be this nuclear annihilation when his friend comes out wearing that silver suit. That's his protection suit, because something's about to happen.
So for 1960s, that was considered what the future would hold.
Yeah, it was only 6 years in the future for the movie makers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So they thought it was going to happen fast.
Yes. Atomic age. It makes sense.
Yes.
There was always a fear because they were talking about mushrooms. This was an era where people were fearful of an atomic warfare where everything would just be annihilated.
Yes, and because the last World War was still fresh in everybody's minds.
That's true. Well, we looked at the time machine itself, and it was shaped like a sled, and that was by design. It was supposed to slide into time. It looked very steampunkish, what we would call now, because a lot of people in the steampunk community love that look. And interesting to note, all the rivets on there were 365 rivets.
Wow, really?
What else did you think about the look of the time machine?
It was a really neat look. It didn't look like a time machine. It almost looked like a Santa sled.
Mm-hmm.
And having the disc in the back that rotates, that it can go real fast. I get the idea that that's supposed to be like a propeller, like except the machine didn't fly, but you still think of it as a propeller. But yeah, and it was neat though. Oh, and when he showed in the beginning of the movie, when he brought out that little tiny model of the time machine.
Yeah, and there was an actual working one that was that small. It was pretty absurd,
funny.
Wasn't it?
Yeah, it was so funny. And he pushes a little tiny lever on it, and you're like, oh wow, and that can actually do something.
Mm-hmm.
And the time machine was actually shown on other things like Big Bang Theory. There was an episode where they actually bought a life-size model of the time machine and had it in their living room. It was hilarious.
It's interesting that the original time machine was sold at an auction in 1971. It was the same studio auction that sold the original Ruby Slippers from The Wizard of Oz. And the winner of the auction was the owner of a traveling show. But only 5 years after that, it showed up at a thrift store in California. And so a historian purchased it for $1,000, and he was friends with George Pal. And so he took the blueprints that George Pal had given him, and along with D.C. Fontana and a few others, rebuilt it to the original specifications to the best that they could. Like, isn't that weird in itself that someone bought it from an auction, but then
and decided they didn't want it?
That's...
Well, I mean, I guess it could have been the person died and their family donated because,
could be. What a random thing to walk into a thrift store and see that.
Right, and see the original one. I mean, that's unbelievable.
Now, there were some pieces missing from the original one, especially the chair. Now, the chair was originally a barber's chair, and there were some pieces of equipment missing because when we see it in full on the movie, they filmed those sequences to show the whole unit in action. But then in order to show the close-ups, they had to pull the chair out. They had to pull different devices out to show the close-ups. So no one ever knows what happens to those pieces that were pulled out. So there's a lot of mystery around the time machine itself.
But it did look very confining when he was in it. So you can understand that they would have to take it out in order to film up close.
And at that time, it wasn't like modern movies where they would make two different models. One model was just for close-up shots, and then another one was fully functional as far as sitting down, getting in, and getting out. They used that one and just kept piecing it together or unpiecing it together.
A lot of things are made now with the intention of getting the cameras inside. I mean, that's why, on the original Star Trek, even back then, the corridors were so wide just to have room for the cameras and things like that.
It is true. Okay, you mentioned Star Trek. When we saw the credits, one name popped out.
Wah Chang.
Okay, Wah Chang is legendary in the original Star Trek world. Why is that?
He made a lot of the props on Star Trek. He designed the tribbles, the original Romulan bird of prey. I mean, the
tricorder.
Yes, just
communicator
amazing stuff. All the iconic stuff, the stuff that we still remember that they still make toys out of today.
That's true. And he was the designer of the Morlocks.
Very interesting. I mean, it's just like these people that were around back then, because this movie was made in probably 1959, released in 1960, and then Star Trek a few years later.
It totally made sense. So you see the connections. One of the reasons why we love looking at older sci-fi movies is you see the connections thematically, but also you're seeing connections with the creative department.
A lot of talented behind-the-scenes people. And he actually was contracted by Desilu Studios, so that's how he got the job on Star Trek.
What'd you think about the look of the Morlocks?
They looked good. I mean, now
I thought it was fantastic. The glowing eyes. What an exciting effect.
It was. It must have been something. Yeah, because they probably couldn't see very well. They were used to darkness, so it must have been some kind of. You would think it's an adaptation to the darkness. Their eyes would glow so they could see better in the dark.
I loved it, and I loved the air of mystery because they're rustling around. There's even one point where a Morlock was camouflaged on the wall, and the camouflage was excellent.
It was eerie, wasn't it?
It was.
I mean, I've heard complaints about it not, holding up today, but I thought it still looked pretty neat.
I'm not going to use today's standards for anything, especially something that old. I wouldn't use today's standards for TV shows and movies from the 90s. But for that time, you realize how advanced that was? I thought it was incredible.
I thought they looked realistic. I mean, because they're supposed to be monsters, they're supposed to be scary, and they were. They were like zombies. I mean, they didn't talk. They would just attack. That's basically what they did. Mm-hmm.
Now, what I found interesting is in the X-Men comics of the 80s, there was an underground group of mutants called the Morlocks. And obviously, this is what Chris Claremont paralleled the X-Men mutant universe to the Morlocks of this movie, that being people who lived underground who really couldn't fit in with society above ground.
Exactly. And I remember that from the X-Men cartoon. They had an episode about the Morlocks. So yeah, they were considered, even worse off than the other mutants, because the other mutants could live above ground. They could fit in among humans, but the Morlocks couldn't, just because they looked different, but also because they were outcasts, they were also evil. They had turned against humans and other mutants because they were shunned and feared.
So what do you think about that theme? That mankind, we're assuming that it was a third world war that annihilated virtually everything. And because of that time ring telling the story, again, another great visual effect. I thought it was beautiful for the time, telling a little storytelling ring, that part of humanity would go underground, and another part of humanity would go above ground, and they ended up separating over time. What do you think about that concept?
I love the concept. So you see these two different races, and they both had the same beginnings, the same ancestors, kind of like Vulcans and Romulans that used to be one race, and then they split off.
Kind of like humanity as we have right now.
The way humans have become different ethnic groups.
Of course.
And it was a fascinating story. They became different because you had the ones that lived above ground and the ones that lived underground, and then the way they developed, the ones that were above ground turned out to be the thoughtless ones, the ones that only existed.
They were the ones that were more like zombies.
That they actually were. They would just eat and sleep. They were very docile. And when when the character George, when he was talking to them, it still reminded me of like The Apple, the episode of the original series, Kirk talking to those people. And
it sure did.
They just don't know anything. They're just like totally oblivious to anything, to existence. And it was just that contrast was so weird.
And the machinery was underground. The Morlocks, who were more assertive, were underground. I mean, you almost got the impression that they were more advanced in many ways, even though to our eyes they looked more savage.
They were the ones who were in charge. So yes, they were the ones who could they had that alarm, and when the alarm went off, it basically hypnotized the Eloi, is what they were called. Mm-hmm. I mean, it basically hypnotized them and made them just walk into the cave like the Sphinx. It was,
and then they were hungry, so
right.
they needed to get some food.
I mean, a story about the people being in control, just wanting the other people to submit, and not able to think for themselves.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it was thought-provoking. I really liked, this predates Planet of the Apes, not only the movie, but the book. I mean, H.G. Wells was such a forward thinker in the realm of science fiction. He's one of the early fathers of science fiction.
Yes, and his original book came out long before this movie was made. It was 1895, so yeah. And
in fact, if you looked on the plaque of the time machine, it said manufactured by H. George Wells. So that was a tribute to the original writer.
Yes, well, I thought
that was great.
I kind of, yeah, so that's why I thought the main character, his name was George. They didn't say his last name, so I think he was supposed to be H.G. Wells in a sense. It was really based on him. It was an homage to him.
Cool, huh?
And I like how George was trying to get these people to do something too. And he kept saying something about humanity, how, oh man, all these centuries of civilization that humanity built, and now it's just gone.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he was so shocked at that, and about how these people knew nothing about it and didn't care, didn't want to do anything about it. They didn't want to know about their history or anything.
With regards to books, they had no interest.
Well, they didn't know how to read.
Exactly. But there was
right.
no preservation of such. Like there was no motivation to do anything. No curiosities. Even when that girl was drowning. Oh well, not my problem.
You're not even caring for each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was an interesting look into what possibly could happen to people
if we become complacent, or if we let someone else control us.
Mm-hmm. Very true. Now, if we remember, we love Destination Moon, another George Pal classic. In Destination Moon, during that time period in the late 40s, George Pal became friends with Walter Lantz because he used that segment of Woody Woodpecker in the movie. Well, they maintained their friendship for years, and George tried to work in some Walter Lantz references in his movies. And we see in this one, when the little girl was running away during the 1960s air raid, she dropped a Woody Woodpecker doll. So it's a nice little Easter egg there, which we think of Easter eggs as a modern thing, but the more and more we look into classic movies, we see that there were bits and pieces of them all along.
Yeah, they drop a little things. And it was also interesting. Yeah, George Pal is known for the stop motion animation, and the way they did it in this was like the perfect movie for his talent, mm-hmm. because it kept showing the way the pictures kept moving, just like the mannequin is the perfect example. That mannequin and it was a woman that kept changing the dress, and yeah, of course, it's amazing that store just stayed there for so long. And
that mannequin was always in the same spot.
I know, but it was great to see it though, the way it kept changing very quickly. You know,
all the fashions over the years.
Yes, that's just a great way to illustrate what's going on here, and I do like the way that George could see what was happening as time was going by. He was looking at things moving by very quickly. Mm-hmm. You don't usually get that in time travel. Usually it's just, 1960 and then 2155 or whatever, and with nothing in between.
That's a good point. Yeah, there was a progression.
Yes.
And even the stop motion with the plants, with the flowers, I think they did a wonderful job of it. With regards to the fruit on the tree, they actually used a painting. And the stop motion of the Morlocks, or the Morlock that died, they made them out of wax and then melted it and then filmed it.
They had some great ideas.
Which reminded me of Raiders of the Lost Ark, because they did something similar. So we're seeing that the pioneers of yesterday influenced filmmakers down the road.
And even having the matte paintings was something else that Star Trek did. But it was part of the idea
Mm-hmm.
using it for this movie was because they couldn't go on location. They didn't have the budget, so they used some matte paintings in this. And it worked out well. And also showing George's other surroundings, showing how, like, a cave came up around him, and they could show the sky and the trees around him, and everything moving very quickly.
Yes.
All of that was a very great visual to see in this movie.
Mm-hmm. And to television station out of New York, Channel 4. This was in 1974 when they started doing movies on TV. This is the first movie that they showed on TV. So, I mean, this was pretty monumental years later. Think about it, in the 70s, it was still being viewed and hailed as something special.
I can imagine. Yeah, because, I mean, you see it and it starts out in the past, and and because it goes into the future, and because it is something that, in that way, is timeless, because the future part of it, I mean, hey, it could still happen. Mm-hmm. You never know. So it was still something that captured people's imaginations. And also, even when they made they did a remake of this movie, which I saw. And,
I never did. What was it like?
It was, I mean, I liked it. I liked the remake too. And it was really, it wasn't, as much like this movie. I mean, except that it did have the thousands of years into the future, and he found the civilization that lives above the ground, and they still had the Morlocks underground. But that was about the only similarity. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think the remake was worth seeing too.
Interesting. One of the things I very much enjoyed about this movie was when George went back to his present in the late 1800s, and he was speaking to his friends, and he had to go back in time. He had to go. They really weren't believing him. So when he left, he went on the sled, time traveled again. They said, look, he had to take something with him. What would he have taken? And they said, 3 books are missing. Well, which 3? And I think this is one of the things that I love about older movies and older media. They leave something and then force you to think for yourself. Force you to walk away and say, okay, what happened? What would I do? What did he do? And the question was, what 3 books did he take? They just dropped it. We don't know. And I thought that was a wonderful way to end the movie. Because now we're pondering, what would be the 3 books that would be most important to him that could potentially help build up a civilization?
That was interesting. And it could have been that he was taking books that meant something to him.
Could be.
But, but we don't know. And yeah, but I assume, when you think about it, like he's probably taking books that he could use to teach these people. Maybe something about social norms, something about government or society.
I hope it's not the book about the Chicago mobs.
I know, wouldn't that be neat? But I don't think these people would copy it, though. but you could see on the shelf it looked like there was like volumes. Mm-hmm. I mean, it kind of looked like he took volume 3 of something. That's what it looked like to me.
Volume 3 of Encyclopedia Britannica.
I know, it just looks like it there. But and also the way it ended was neat because I mean, so the friend really just assumed. Well, and I think he assumed right, but he said, oh, okay, so the reason he moved the machine back inside was so that when he goes back to the future, he'll be.
That's right.
Yeah, he won't be inside the.
He will land.
Morlock.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He'll land at the correct spot.
And so, yeah, and I'm glad he said that because at first I was going, why would he move it back if he was just going to use it again? Mm-hmm. But yeah, now that made sense. And it's just assumed that he went back to the same time that he left when he left the woman Weena. He wanted to go back to her and to that civilization and to help them rebuild their society, which is so cool.
It is.
And it would be great to see like a sequel to that and see what happened.
Positive ending. I liked it. I liked it a lot. I liked the entire body of the movie. I think the visual effects were fantastic for the time. And when we rewatch it, you see little nuances of creativity, which I think are always exciting. Technicolor movie. And
having the rings that could talk, which doesn't take really much tech to do that, but it was such a neat idea.
Sure was. I mean, I love it. Absolutely. I would recommend it for anybody who's into science fiction.
And old movies.
Yeah, I mean, this is George Pal. He's in the pantheon of movie-making wonders because of movies like this.
Most definitely. Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.